Well, welcome everybody. It's your Monday afternoon coffee break with Dr. Joe Lamb in Gig
And
Harbor,
Michael
Washington,
Stone.
and Ashland, Oregon. So, Joe, what the heck is
Yeah,
going on?
it's been a beautiful weekend here in Gig Harbor. How about down there?
Yeah, it has been. We've had a little bit of smoke blow in and out, but the Bootleg Fire, largest fire in Oregon, is continuing to burn northeast through sagebrush and juniper and non-populated areas, but depending on how the wind blows, we have intermittent smoke. Other than that, I'm ready. I think I'm ready for over 90 plus degrees every day for the last 6 weeks to be done.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be ready for that to be done too.
I think one of the things that hit the news today was that, and we know this, right, from air pollution studies, but people who are exposed a lot to the particulate levels have increased inflammatory response and have greater incidence of respiratory viruses, including COVID. So, get those air filters if you need them for your home and continue to mask. And other than that, have a great summer.
Yeah. Well, I was interested to see over the weekend that, you know, we have a tendency not to think about the impact of these fires beyond local and regional. And certainly, like when we were traveling back from Feathered Pipe Ranch, there were fires and smoke that we went through. Courtney and I driving back went through. I don't know what it was like for you flying, if you got above them or not, but there were definitely fires and there were definitely places you couldn't see. But I saw a news story as well over the weekend of the impact in New York City of the fires out here and the higher particulate matter.
That's right. There's groups that track that stuff, and they can predict, depending on what the air currents are, the increased incidence of COPD and asthma patients in ERs in New York City, even depending on what pollution blooms there are in China or fires in the Northwest. So, all these events are global, and it pushes us maybe to chat about what simple things you can do for smoke to improve your resilience. And one of those is taking enough vitamin C, 500 to 1,000 milligrams more, and also adding NAC, one of the important amino acids to help you make glutathione. And that's been shown to really help folks with a lot of particulate and smoke exposure.
Yeah, that would make sense because when you think about it, they're not quite advanced glycosylation end products, but they are combustion end products. And they're going to be oxidized and they're going to be modified, and it's going to be something that's foreign to us for the most part. Your comment earlier got me thinking about something we were discussing actually earlier, which was the news and the way the world is these days and the impressions that we form about it, and just how a difficult environment partly contributes to this whole question of sheltering children. And you brought up a term that I had not heard previously, but that we need to be free-ranging our children once again.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm glad you brought that up. A number of years ago, a New York reporter, pointed out that her 9-year-old son wanted to go on the subway by himself to a different part of the city, and she initially had a little trepidation, but then she recognized how often she was on subways and how safe they were. And she ended up writing a column after her 9-year-old child went a number of stops up, visited a friend a number of stops back, and she was castigated as a terrible mother. But we were chatting about that. How do we in today's age allow the range of our children to be greater than hovering snowplow parents, where you're always creating a road for your kids? How do you allow them to discover? How do you allow grandkids and children to discover the successes and challenges of, for example, crossing a ditch with a little bit of water in it on a narrow board? Do you make sure they have their hand held the whole time, or do you say, wow, lose your balance and yeah, your feet get wet? How do we do that as parents, let alone as individuals, let alone as aunts and uncles, let alone as humans, to allow our children to discover very practically the effects of gravity or the joys of going out in the woods without always having a parent there? I mean, yeah. It raises interesting questions.
It does. I think one of the biggest influences on my decision making as an adult and as a doctor was racing motorcycles. There's a general rule. Well, there are two general rules that I read in a book years and years ago about racing motocross. Number one was you can't pass anybody who you're following because they're in front of you, number one. And so if you're following them through the very same part of the curve, right? Like if they're going inside and you go inside, you can't get around them. And number two, even if they wreck, you can't get around them, because if you're that close, you're on top of them and you wreck too. So that was rule number one. You can't pass anyone who you're following. And rule number two was you have to either be full on your throttle or full on your brake at all times if you want to win. And it made me, it sounds like that's a bad thing, right? Because it sounds like there is no gray. But it actually makes you have to think about the distinction between, the two sides of a question, and then it makes you decide that you want to commit. And it takes a lot of the things that we do in life out of the waffle zone. And I learned both of those lessons racing motorcycles, which I don't think I would have been real excited about if any of my kids had wanted to do.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? How often do we hear stories? When I was a kid, I was able to. And after 20 years of, a little over 20 years, 25 years of up to the minute 24/7 cable news that captures the sensations, how often do we watch a little chyron at the bottom that says, 9-year-old girl missing in Phoenix, Arizona. And here we are in Oregon or in Washington. And in the days of the telegraph, or in other days before 24/7 digital immediacy, that angst or that fear or that concern or that empathy or any of the emotion associated with a chyron that talks about a 9-year-old girl missing, we wouldn't even know it, let alone it wouldn't impact, in many ways, the fear or concern center of our brain. So how much is that affecting how we raise children, grandchildren, impact other humans, let alone interact with a deep breath and gratitude, things that are around us as we walk through our day?
Yeah. Well, two comments to that fact. Number one, as adults, it raises the question, are we being driven by the soundbite, or do we have good data that there is more or less risk for our children now than there used to be? And then number two, as a child, yes, I was warned about staying away from cars, and I was warned about, people trying to give you candy, and I was warned about all of those things. But there weren't as frequent reminders of actually horrible things happening. Like, if you are a 7-year-old child and you can read and you're watching the news with your parents, or your parents have, CNN on all the time, or Fox, or whatever it happens to be, and the trailer goes across the bottom as a child, you've seen it. And then children know what Amber Alerts are.
Yeah.
So driving down the highway, they see a sign that says Amber Alert. And if they don't know what it is, they ask, what's that? And, and suddenly you're explaining it. And it's an interesting one. And, I've looked on and off through the years, because my gut reaction has been to be fairly protective and fairly non-trusting. I'm not real sure if the situation is worse today than it used to be.
Yeah. And so then it comes to, so how can we bring the immediacy of a mindful component? Because, all those things have a slight cortisol influencing effect on us. How do we bring the mindful component into what's happening now for our children? Are you, coming back to what you said, are we really at increased risk? Look at what's around us, being aware. How do we train around about the environment, recognizing patterns of peace, patterns of safety versus patterns of uncertainty versus patterns of danger, and not confusing those, because as we know from ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences, there many of us growing up, and as defined, and depending on your background, have variable levels of adverse childhood reactions that influence our response. And so I think we get to take all that into account when we start talking about free ranging. You and I might free range in a rural setting, or we might free range in the inner city, depending on our understanding of our environment. And so a lot of this education is understanding our environment.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important one, because I think people would be surprised if they went and took an adverse childhood event questionnaire and saw actually how many points they would get on a scale of 10, and how many of us would get points on a scale of 10. And it calls out that there's portions of our life which are probably a lot more serious. The spectrum of mental health and the lack of mental health in families is probably a much greater risk than the overall risk to kids of these random events. So number one, it speaks to how do we just improve mental health in families, and I have some thoughts about that. But the flip side of this that I wanted to bring up is that, as we talk about these things happening to kids today, there are places, as you commented earlier, where these events are not only not rare, but they're commonplace, and they happen on a daily basis, and they change the way we think. I wonder, and the final comment I'll make about this before, I wonder about whether this is living in fear and non-specific, and we don't act upon it, but it makes us nervous And instead of training our kids to be safe, we guard them. And at the same time, as I think about the shows that are on television, and shows that I've watched myself and used to watch a good bit in the past, have we made some of this horror entertainment instead?
No, it's a good point. I guess it's part of it is, isn't it? A part of it is learning how our children respond to those different settings. And this of course ages me, but people can already see that I'm aged by my gray hair. But it was interesting after 9/11, and it was our 4 children that asked us to get rid of cable TV because how random the frightful pictures would come on the screen. And so it was interesting. Our 4 children wanted control over the anxiety instigating, the sadness instigating visuals and sounds. And so how do we respond to that uncertain angst or sadness? How do our children respond to that? And then how can we shift that so that there is a safe place? Because from a safe place, then you can venture out into things that are less known, as long as you know there's a place to come back. And something you mentioned is who are the adults that we can draw on? Who are the adults that we can draw on that aren't our parents that may offer safety? Or who are the figures that we can draw on for our children? Where is the safe place when parents aren't there? And at some times when we were growing up, that might have been a neighbor. You could always go to their house. That might have been a safety officer. That might have been a teacher or a place in the community. It may have been a drugstore that you could go into because you knew the person. It's how do we create that space?
Yeah. Well, I think, to me, the first part, it kind of goes with some of the work that we've been doing in terms of our retreats and everything. It's figuring out what's important to us and meaningful to us and valuable to us, knowing what it is that we want to live into, and balancing that at the same time with trying to get rid of some of the distractions. Because I can tell you that, you and I have been working on some data and a research project and cleaning up a data set. And the issues with that have made me kind of twang.
Sure.
And if I'm not really sensitive to that twang, or sensitive to all the other things that are going on at the moment, I start making decisions about how I want to treat my kids, or how I want to guard my house, or where I want to go, out of, instead of a calm, quiet place, a practiced place from, a meditative experience, and knowing the distinction between, confusion and agitation and real physical danger. I make those kind of decisions, and I make poor ones because I'm not really considering all of that. And, as you said, I wonder a little bit to myself as I look at kids, and as I look at my own kids, I wonder, did I do a good enough job of teaching them practical decision making about stuff? And I think I attempted to, but I see the difference between myself and others in this regard. And I wonder if I did as good of a job with my kids as my parents and grandparents did with me.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always a challenge of self-judgment, isn't it? And maybe what are the life experiences and things that you may query your children, or you may consider when grandchildren come along. I think the free range children or free range kid component really asks us to examine how much protective surrounding we're giving our children, so that they can't learn some of the basic intuitive things that we're always encouraged to learn. You talked about when we talked earlier how you would range when you were a child. You'd go down to the pool, you'd ride 15 miles on your bike, you would do all this other stuff, and you just had to be home by 5 or 6, time for dinner. And that was frequently the case for me also. And so you just see patterns. You just see patterns that have changed. And it's more of a self-reflective thing about, are we not too protective, but are we allowing enough free ranging of children and free ranging of thought, just less secluded control of people we're trying to raise?
Yeah, I think it's a really valuable one, because I realize that my children, who are now all adults, and this happened in the last 7 months or so, but my children are all 18 or older. They really got free range when they got a driver's license. And for me, free range happened much earlier. I can actually remember getting into trouble in 2nd grade the first time I free ranged and didn't come home after 2nd grade, because I stopped to play on the way home. And I can remember that very clearly. But over the next couple of years, there were boundaries. Like, you can play in those woods because
Right.
there are no wells down in the bottomland in those woods. You can't play in those woods because there are old spring houses and old wells down in that valley, and they're not well marked, and you could fall down a well. So don't play over there, but you can play over here. Or things like, as you were talking about, the comment about don't get, you said, be home by dinner, but, it was like, don't get the library books wet.
Right.
And, and I had this discussion with my mother at one point in time as we were sitting in the Chinese restaurant where my building was. My office building was, and the Chinese restaurant was on the 1st floor. And Elizabeth said she wanted to get dessert, and she was like 7. And I had 7, probably more like 9. And I had come down to dinner late to meet my parents and my wife. And we had a small child as well. And Elizabeth wanted to go across the street to the CVS to get some candy. And my mother pulled out a $5 bill and said, Elizabeth, go ahead. And I was like, she can't walk out there alone and go across the street and go to that shopping center. And my mother looked at me like, you used to come here every day during the summer.
Yeah.
And the attitudes were different. And I basically said, the only way she gets to walk across that parking lot is if I'm standing at the top of the hill with a 30-06 and I have a good sight line on whoever approaches her.
You're very protective, Joe.
Yes. And it ended up being that I didn't finish dinner and I took her to CVS. But the shopping center had also changed a lot. And the question is, and the area had changed. And I guess the question that makes this difficult is, do we know well enough, and have we reached out far enough to be comfortable in our communities as our communities have changed. Because, I'm not sure that the community was any less or more dangerous, but it was certainly more diverse.
Right, right. And so an example I had along those lines is when you know your community and the community knows you, then in all honesty, humans are human. They want to protect the children that they know that aren't necessarily theirs, but they're community children.
Right.
So there were times raising our children in smaller towns that somebody came up and said, such and such of your children was down there by the creek, and I told him he had to pull back and he had to come back here and check in with you. I hope that was okay. And it was like, absolutely. Thanks for doing that. You were the eyes, right?
Right.
And willingness to speak up because you care and you had relationship. And so I guess that's the thing that it really pushes all this is, how do we develop relationship? How do we deal with our fears? How do we deal with the uncertainty of community? How do we allow people to live with more autonomy, but in a place that we consider safe? And how do we free ourselves from those really oppressive fears that promotes isolation?
Yeah, I guess part of it is by doing what we're doing. I've given this more thought in the last half an hour by talking about it than I've given in a long period of time. And maybe, and I'm not one to speak to censorship, but maybe we need to move some of this out of the realm of entertainment and move it into back into the range of, it's truly horrible when these things happen, but let's not live with it. I mean, I don't know if it's ever happened to you that it's hard to draw the distinction between fact and fiction.
Absolutely.
And it occurs to me that if I remember once being in downtown Chicago at the University of Illinois at Chicago, right there in the medical district of Chicago. And I wanted to ask where the hospital where ER was.
Right.
Because I had watched it enough that it had to be as real as Rush or Northwestern or UIC or whatever. It had to be right here somewhere, right?
Right.
And of course it wasn't. But, when we live this world where we see all these violent models on television, maybe we need to really ask ourselves as a society, why do we find that entertaining?
It's true. And you bring up the question of how do you associate or dissociate? And the dissociation that happens in children varies depending on age, where fiction is reality and there's no discernment. How is that being shifted? And what are the touch points that we can say, this is real to you? And how can we have more things be real together? A little more challenging than the virtual Zoomness of the last 18 months, isn't it?
Right.
It's a little harder in the isolated lack of or diminished community in the last 18 months. So how do we restore that to know that this is to bring in more safety, to bring in less fear? And how can we do that in this masked, semi-masked world? And that's the challenge for all of us.
Yeah. And from that regard, I remember watching, and I don't remember the name of the movie, but it was The Journey Home or something. And it had Michael J. Fox's voice being the voice for an animal. And the animals were all trying to find their way home. And something bad was about to happen. And I explained to Elizabeth that, there are in movies, things are make-believe. And she's like, yes, Dad, I know cartoons are make-believe. They're what someone drew. but these are real animals and this is happening. She was like 4.5 years old, and she was absolutely sure that whatever was there was a real representation. Just like, she had seen the films we had made of her childhood, right? And that was real. And so real actors, real animals, real stuff. And I guess what it comes down to is just having those conversations and making sure that we take those teaching moments, and it makes me want to that much more make the distinction between the true stresses in my life and not just those things that are novel, unpredictable, threats to ego, and sense of losses of control that Sonia Lupier talks about as being nuts. And instead trying to make that distinction. So a meditative practice, and then talking with people, and then defining as a family who we go to, who's safe, having that discussion with kids, having a discussion with kids, if you think about what we were saying earlier, all the stuff about police currently, would a young child feel safe going to a police officer at this point in time?
Well, I think we can encourage. I mean, we can encourage that, but it takes a very mindful approach, right?
Right. It takes modeling. It takes us as adults showing respect for other people in the community, and it just takes conversations. I hope we find, you have grandchildren already. I don't, but I hope as we navigate the world that all of us can find ways to make those kids continue to be safe, but have broad life expectancies.
Well, once again, Joe, this was a great 30 minutes afternoon coffee break. And
it was.
Thanks again.
Thank you. And we'll be back next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.